There is a vulnerability that we experience when we have our deepest beliefs challenged. And with that vulnerability comes a desire to protect ourselves, a lot of fear, a lot of questions about, well, if I don't believe this, what do I believe? And a kind of feeling like a free falling feeling that where will we end up if we start here and I start to unpack or loosen the attachment I have to a system of beliefs that I've grown up with or believe developed over time, to believe that this is really the way that I want to see the world. And it's the way I think other people ought to see the world, and it's the way everybody ought to see the world. That doesn't hold so well right now in this moment. So the experience that many people have now is feeling out of it. We feel alienated from others because they see things differently from us. And we feel alienated from the general buzz that we get through the media, which hardly seems to educate us, just seems to reinforce things that we wonder whether they're true or not. So there's a chance here to kind of break that up, and that takes courage.
The Center for Understanding and Conflict welcomes you to The Other Chair, a monthly podcast exploring the dynamics of conflict and how to bring the human issues to the table. Together with our guests, we explore how the power of understanding each other can lead to better solutions for people on both sides of an issue. We will also share tips for managing your own mediation practice, approaching conflict in the professional world, and ways to apply our understanding-based model in your personal life.
Hello to our listeners, and welcome to The Other Chair. My name is James Dyke. Today's guest needs no introduction. It's Gary Friedman, author, mediator, and co-founder of the Center for Understanding and Conflict, nonprofit educational institute dedicated to advancing the understanding-based approach to conflict resolution and mediation. In this episode of The Other Chair, Gary is going to discuss how deeply held beliefs, fears, and the conflict traps we set for ourselves create divisions not only between groups, but also within individuals struggling to reconcile personal values with societal pressures. This episode will challenge listeners to reflect on the impact of polarized perspectives and provide tools to engage in constructive dialogue amid deep-seated differences. So hello, Gary. Welcome back to The Other Chair.
Thanks for having me, James.
Thanks as always for being here. So that introduction promises a lot in about a half an hour. And so, we're going to do our best. And I appreciate you being here to help tackle this topic. So first off, let's start by talking about the role of ideological divides in interpersonal and intrapersonal conflicts. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how the understanding-based approach views conflict as an opportunity for deeper understanding.
So we are, not to mention the understatement of the year, in very fraught times where we're experiencing enormous commotion, upset, disruption, dysregulation, and it's a very painful time for many of us all across the world. And usually we just focus on the problem that creates for us. But there's also an opportunity that it creates, because getting things stirred up, especially at the deepest level between us, allows for an opportunity for us to actually find new things that we hadn't discovered about ourselves before, or our deeply held ideological beliefs and the problems that we get into when we hold on to those beliefs in the face of information that seems to be very upsetting to us. So ideology in some ways is a great thing, because at least it brings us into the territory of asking ourselves, what is it that we believe? And we often will catch on to a particular set of ideological beliefs, political beliefs, religious beliefs, all kinds of different beliefs, where there's a whole system and set of things that come along with saying, I'm a whatever it is that captures that. So throwing that up for grabs is pretty interesting, because it means we have a chance to kind of break up these different ideas that kind of we haven't really examined so much, and tend to adopt them whole hog. And so what we're in this moment, we have the chance to kind of take a look at those things and see what is it we actually do believe and what is it that no longer fits for us in terms of our life or in terms of the way we see the world. And that's what makes this such an exciting time, particularly as we go through all of the incredible Sturm und Drang that's part of this moment in time. So at the core, it's a good thing to be asking ourselves, what is it we really think? What is it we really believe? And there's nothing like disagreement to kind of stir that up at the deepest level. So generally speaking, we avoid conversations with people who see things differently than we do. We tend to be attracted to people who see things like we do and avoid conversations with even those we love when we feel like there's an ideological divide between us and them. So this is really a moment when it feels like it's a luxury we can no longer afford. Why? The reason is we have relationships that matter to us. And these relationships are endangered because, in fact, by avoiding the conversations that we might have with people with whom we disagree, we leave ourselves kind of alone and separated from these people that we care about. And that's a terrible shame for us, a terrible shame for the relationships, the people that we really care about that are part of our lives, to just be dismissed or separated because we happen to see the world differently. So in the center, we find ourselves, there are a number of tools that we can use that will allow for conversations that can be constructive. And the way I think about that is, it's not like if there are people that with whom we see things differently, that we're going to come together and be able to convince them that they're wrong, or for us to decide that we're wrong, but actually to go beyond right and wrong and see if we can kind of capture what's there at the core of what it is we believe, and see if we can expand to take into account how other people see things, even when those things stir us up and upset us and seem to create this tremendous challenge and alienation that's often part of it when we encounter people that we care about who see things differently. So we start with the questions, and I think there's a lot of talk these days about have conversations with people whom you have different ideologies than you, and I think that's fine, but those tend to be mostly intellectual exchanges, or exchanges where we have political arguments, and those arguments usually don't get us very far. We're hoping that we're going to convince somebody else that they're wrong, and they're hoping we're going to be convinced that we're wrong, and they're pretty unsatisfying conversations. But there's another opportunity, particularly with people with whom we have real relationships, and that is to have those conversations, but to not be governed by the traps that are often there in those conversations. The traps are trying to figure out, the point of the conversation is for us to convince each other that the other is wrong. And that's a nowhere going conversation by and large. What's a more interesting conversation is to think about the standard that we set for ourselves in CUC, about how do we measure a successful conversation. A successful conversation, we think, and that's why we're the U of CUC, understanding, the power of understanding. Understanding what? Understanding ourselves, understanding the other, understanding the subject that we're talking about. And if we can have a conversation with somebody with whom we disagree and advance the ball on any one of those three axes, it's a successful conversation. And it's not a conversation that's intended to transform the way we think. It's a step on the way, and it allows for a connection between the people that we care about, and we can actually be in process with these conversations and have these conversations over a period of time where we pick different areas. We decide, let's talk about this, and let's see if we can come out of us, either of us or both of us, hopefully, with a better understanding of ourselves, the other, and the problem.
Conflict manifests itself in many ways in our personal lives, for professionals in the workplace and for practitioners who have made a career bringing together parties in conflict through mediation practice. Each month, the Center for Understanding in Conflict hosts live webinars with featured guests discussing best practices and sharing their experiences for tackling conflict using the understanding-based model.
Let's take a step back a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, and talk a little bit about what are some of the underlying needs or fears that keep people entrenched in these ideological divides? And then, practically speaking, because there's such a gulf between them, and how do you begin to get into a situation where you can have an open conversation or start to build understanding when in many cases, both sides of the conflict see the other as a polar opposite, a danger almost in some ways, an existential threat as the common narrative goes. How would you approach that?
Yeah, so there is a vulnerability that we experience when we have our deepest beliefs challenged. And with that vulnerability comes a desire to protect ourselves, a lot of fear, a lot of questions about, well, if I don't believe this, what do I believe? And a kind of feeling, like a free-falling feeling that where will we end up if we start here and I start to unpack or loosen the attachment I have to a system of beliefs that I've grown up with or believe developed over time, to believe that this is really the way that I want to see the world. And it's the way I think other people ought to see the world, and it's the way everybody ought to see the world. That doesn't hold so well right now in this moment. So the experience that many people have now is feeling out of it. We feel alienated from others because they see things differently from us. And we feel alienated from the general buzz that we get through the media, which hardly seems to educate us, just seems to reinforce things that we wonder whether they're true or not. So there's a chance here to kind of break that up. And that takes courage to be able to say, okay, I'm going to kind of throw open the questions of what it is I believe and engage in one-on-one conversations with people who I think might be willing to have those conversations. So you ask the questions, well, where would you even begin? And it begins with thinking about people that you care about, if you know any, who see the world differently than you, and with whom you feel this kind of distance, that because you feel this either political or religious or other ideological divide, and say, I'd like to actually feel closer to this person. I'd like to actually feel like we're not divided because we know we love each other, or we know we care about each other, and we can use that common feeling of kinship and caring to kind of support a really hard conversation. And so it's not like we're just going out there willy-nilly looking for anybody to talk to. We're looking for conversations where there are relationships that matter to us, and where we hope that there's a level of mutual respect each of us have for the other, even though we might see things very differently, but enough respect so we have a motivation to want to be able to come closer to these people and see if we can actually find areas of understanding, even in the face of tremendous differences. So, religion, there's a kind of often a rule families have. We're not going to talk about religion. We're not going to talk about politics. We're not going to talk about any of these things that really matter to us. And what that does is it leaves us feeling alienated and kind of at sea and not very reassured, especially as we have this Thanksgiving and holidays coming up. This is particularly a time when we don't want to rock the boat. But the fact is, the boat is already rocked. The boat is rocked because we're all reeling from the changes that are happening in the world. We're all reeling from the insecurities we're experiencing. We're all reeling in different ways from the public discourse, which is very unsettling and scary and leaves us feeling kind of alone, alienated, and even depressed. So this is a chance to kind of call upon these relationships to find something that's actually mutually supportive, even though it's based in very different views that we might have of the world. And at the core, I think the biggest problem in the world we have is that when we find differences more alienating or upsetting than interesting, we're in trouble. And if we can just realize it's really interesting, we have a chance to expand our understanding of who we are, our relationships, and how we see the world, including the ideologies that comes from calling upon the good feeling that's there, the reservoir of love or caring that's there between us and people that we've either grown up with or we've gotten to know well or that matter to us in the world. So thinking about those people, we might decide there's one of them that we'd like to try to do this with. And I'd like to describe how we'd go about doing this. It starts first with thinking in your mind, who is it that I really care about, that I feel might be interested in having this kind of conversation with me? So if it's somebody that you love and you know that you're absolutely sure that they wouldn't want to have this conversation with you, think again. Maybe they're feeling the same way you are. Maybe they're feeling that you wouldn't be willing to have that conversation, or that's not something that it would be too threatening. So you'd have to kind of sift through those relationships and allow for the possibility, just the possibility, that you might be able to have a conversation with them that kind of brings you closer together, brings you more deeply into understanding yourself, and also helps you understand more about your place in the world and where these systems of thought fit and don't fit the way you're living your life and want to be living your life.
Throughout the year, the Center for Understanding in Conflict hosts in-depth basic and advanced certificate programs designed to train you to become effective mediators and conflict resolution professionals centered in the understanding-based model. Our training programs have been the gold standard in alternative dispute resolution for 40 years and is popular within the legal community with human resource professionals, ombudsmen, and corporate workplace mediation clients.
The understanding-based approach emphasizes empathy and a form of active listening called looping, as you well know. So two-part question. How can this approach and this tool help bridge divides and reduce reactivity, especially around ideological conflicts? And then are there any specific practices you could share today with some who may not know the depth and nuance within this approach, especially looping, that people can use to start those conversations?
Starts with an intention on your part to want to actually understand the other person. And usually we're not that interested in understanding somebody else. We're more interested in having them understand us. So we'd have to get over that barrier to realize there's a trade here that's possible. I'm willing to make some effort to understand you if you're willing to make some effort to understand me. And looping is a technique, if people are willing to learn it and use it, that actually allows for that to happen. And the way looping works is we take turns, each of us talking about something, maybe our view about a particular thing. And then we ask the people to reflect back their understanding of what we said, not just parroting what we've said, but actually reflect back what they really understand we've said. And then we say, yeah, you got it. And if we got it, the loop is complete. But if we say, no, that's not quite what I mean, then we have a chance to correct it. And then they say, what did you miss? And we fill them in. And it goes on until we're satisfied that they've demonstrated their understanding of us to our satisfaction. Now, usually, if we're the ones that know or are interested in this and the other person is not, we'd probably have to be the person that goes first to be the one that does the looping, that does the understanding, and invite the other person to talk about how they see things. And then we would loop that until they felt understood about a particular topic. And then once we felt that there was enough understanding of that, then we'd switch. And we try to do the same with them and see if that could be reciprocal. So that brings us to some kind of connection of understanding. That's what happens at a kind of horizontal level in our relationship with people. At a deeper level, what happens is as we do looping, as we really speak and reach for in our own lives the things that we care about, we have a chance to reach deeper into ourselves. So if you're listening to this conversation and just think about some area where you're feeling like, well, here's a topic I'm interested in. And I actually feel maybe that's kind of a little bit up for grabs. I don't feel as strongly about this right now. The events of what's happening in the world have kind of shaken that belief. Well, that's a really interesting one for you to be willing to explore. So if you're feeling a little shaky, that's a good sign that you're open to reaching for something more, that the old way in which you've seen things is not as satisfying as it used to be. And so you'll be able to, if you can find a base of purchase in yourself to look at that more deeply, then you have a chance to express it and see. And as we go to this kind of deeper level in ourselves, we often reach this point where we think things like, well, I'm not so sure about that. Or I used to think I knew this really well, but I'm not so sure right now. I don't know. I don't know is a fabulous place to be, and to evoke that with the person we're talking about. What is it that the conversations are much less interesting when we're just sharing what we're so sure of is right. Much more interesting when we're sharing the I don't knows. Here's the thing that I'm so uncertain about. So I'd like to be able to explore that with you. And I don't know if you feel uncertain about that too, but if you do, I'd find that really interesting because we might be able to mix it up and maybe come to some different understanding of things that we've long held to be the way we see the world. What do you think about that? Are you willing to do that? And so this all becomes bit by bit mutual deepening of understanding of what it is that's really at the bottom of how we see the world.
So you've touched on some themes of self-awareness, and I think that's a great place to begin this next part of our conversation, because let's say we've followed these steps, we've put ourselves out there, we've taken a noble approach to trying to get to know more about those in our lives who maybe think and feel very differently than us. And we're at the table, we're beginning to have this conversation, maybe looping back some of the things we're hearing. And now these emotions are starting to surge up in us. It might be anger, defensiveness, reactivity. What advice would you give listeners who are struggling with that, and how they can be aware or maybe catch those before they start to muddle the process or get out the door before they can pull it back in?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. What happens is we think, if we have feelings, especially troubling feelings, that's going to get in the way of the conversation. That's going to disturb it. In fact, going into our feelings, recognizing our feelings, feeling our feelings shows the direction of where the understanding needs to go. So when we have these feelings, particularly feelings of confusion or uncertainty or fear or upset, that's the entry point inside ourselves that, if we can follow down to the root, allows us to find some deeper place inside ourselves. And in fact, these conversations that I'm suggesting, if they don't reach the level of feelings, they're going to be much more likely to be superficial and not so interesting to us. When they strike a nerve, and we know they strike a nerve because we feel it in our bodies, we feel it in our feelings. When they strike that nerve, now's the pay dirt time, when this is the area that it's worth for us to excavate that, find out, what is that feeling? Where does that come from? How did I come to this? And if you, of course, can do that with the person you're talking with, it's even better, because you can get their help and say, well, how does that come across to you? We hardly ever have conversations with people that we care about where we say, I'm really interested in how you see me. And I'm also interested in be willing to tell you how I see you. We hardly ever get that kind of feedback in the world. But it's so interesting. There's so much about, especially in relationships where we care about people, where we've had impressions of other people that are often quite inaccurate, or they have impressions of us that we think are quite inaccurate, but maybe they're not. And so if we can bring the conversation to, how do you see me and how do I see you? And really kind of plumb the depths of that. Now, this is the most optimistic talking about. This is a conversation. If you had this level of conversation, I would say, wow, this is like, a 9 or a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. If you don't get to this, it's not an unsuccessful conversation. But wouldn't it be interesting if you could have conversations And, I would suggest you don't do this with people that you're really, really close to all the time, your partner in life or your mother, your father, but you might. But if it's somebody that you care enough about to respect and don't have so much baggage in your relationship with each other, that stuff would get in the way. It's a fantastic opportunity to be able to be with others in the world where you actually have a chance of expanding yourselves and expanding your understanding of them, which is at least as important as your understanding of yourself.
This podcast is supported by our CUC Connect members, whose yearly membership includes free attendance to our live monthly webinars, 12 additional featured recordings of past training events, and support from our network of certified trainers for continued professional development. Consider joining CUC Connect today and dive deeper into the understanding-based model.
So, Gary, you have a lot of professional experience, obviously, as a mediator and conflict resolution practitioner. You've been teaching the model since you co-created it over 40 years ago. But you've also been on this merry-go-round in society, politically and ideologically, for a while. And I'm wondering if, within the context of all of that, if you have a story you could share where the understanding-based approach or the principles, closest to it helped people bridge an ideological divide.
As successful as I have felt as a mediator and as a teacher, when it comes to these kinds of conversations, I'm in the soup just like everybody else. And I'm struggling myself with trying to find what is it that I believe. And so I find that very interesting. So I had, of course, what's been well known, a political disaster in my life where I ran for political office and found myself at sea responding to what was happening in the community. People's hostility toward me surprised me in my position of authority in the community. But it made sense to me ultimately when I realized that, in fact, I was not operating in the way that I try to teach others to operate. And so I had to kind of take a step back and ask myself, what is really going on? And how do I really want to be in relationship to others? And so there are a number of examples I can give you of where people in my community disagreed with me about very important things about how the community should be run. And the one question was whether or not people in the community were willing to step forward and live up to my vision of us being all equal and all engaged and really a kind of a group together, all pulling together. And I had that very much shaken when I saw that people in the community weren't willing to do that. They wanted me to run things, but then they wanted me to run things so that they can criticize me when I screwed up. So I found that was pretty interesting, that I was experiencing the responsibility and not much when it came to the power. So that was a very important time in my life when I realized that the relationships actually are more important than whatever it is that I believe. But when it comes down to it, it's not about choosing between relationship and politics. It's about seeing the relationship between the relationship and the politics. So if we can kind of be one person with our recognizing our relationships are the container that hold the possibility of having a political conversation where we might even change our minds, or not change our minds, but reinforce and look more deeply into what it is we believe and why we believe it. That's a good thing. So I think I came out with a number of relationships in the community where I was able to have conversations with people that were quite intimate, that were also political. And I felt because of that, I was able to kind of pull out of the dregs of where I had been caught in the community's upset with me, and actually, frankly, my upset with myself, because I was disappointed that I wasn't able to be more of what I would recommend to others to be, because I was caught just like everybody's caught in our reactions to each other and defensiveness and fears and all kinds of stuff that are threatening. And this is if we can have those feelings and realize those feelings are not us, they're just feelings that we have, and we pass through them, and we understand them and we try to find some place within us that's deeper than those feelings, then we get to the core of what we really believe. And that's where we can be. And of course, we don't get there and we'll just stay there. It's like we touch those at best for moments, but we experience them, and it actually brings us closer together with people that we see things differently from.
This is a great story to illustrate not only your humble nature, but the importance of personal responsibility in these conversations. Because I could probably go out on a limb and say that there are folks who feel so strongly on either side of the ideological divide, especially in the United States, that it's really about coming to a conversation and using this process to figure out how to get the wrong person realize that they're wrong and bring them home to what is right. And I think the story you've just shared, and thank you for sharing it, did a great job. You were really at the center of that, and your role in what went wrong and then later what went right. It really started with, you in this scenario, rather than, I think a lot of us might be tempted to start that story with the community who didn't react or respond in the way that you had hoped in the beginning. And now you're trying to mend with them. But really, what did I do in that situation? What have I contributed to the conflict in this conversation? And so can you touch a little bit about how personal responsibility can come into play, especially when you look at some of the difficult conversations that might be coming in the holiday season?
Pain. When we experience pain, we think, oh my God, this is wrong. I'm experiencing pain. And so I want to push the pain away. And in fact, if we realize the pain is our ally, and also pain is a connector, because it's not just us that's suffering, other people are suffering too. And if we can reach this level where we allow ourselves to experience our pain and have the vulnerability to show our pain and reveal that and see if we're met, maybe not in exactly the same way that we'd want to be met, but also when that happens and things get so real that we're experiencing that pain and we can bring the conversation to that level of pain, then it gives us a whole different base from which to be able to have more of a conversation, and also to really bring our relationship current and to find a way to be supported by each other and to support each other. Because ultimately, when we're living in community, that's really where it's at. We can't find a way to support each other be supported by others, being willing to be supported by others, then we stay fractured, divided, and kind of alienated.
Okay, Gary, last question for you. If you could give listeners, and we've got listeners from all over the world, mediators, practitioners, teachers, or just the conflict curious, one key takeaway from today's discussion on using the understanding-based approach to try to begin to manage these ideological conflicts, what would it be?
Think of a person in your life that you care about and that you think it might really be a challenge to engage with. And just imagine in your mind's eye what it would be like to feel closer to them and to feel like you can have a conversation across your ideological divides that you'd like to be able to feel closer to them from. And if you can just think of that person and then just think about how would you go about inviting them to be able to have a conversation with you. If you were able to do that, I think you'd find it really worth it, even if you ended up deciding not to do it, or they said no. At least you said, I'm there to meet you, and you looked for a place where they would meet you, and you couldn't find it yet for now.
Well, thank you, Gary, so much for being here today. And as always, for sharing important insights with our community about how to tackle conflict through understanding in our increasingly divided world.
Thanks, James.
Gary Friedman is a pioneer in the field of conflict resolution and mediation, and the co-author of Challenging Conflict, Mediation Through Understanding. If you would like to learn more about the understanding-based approach to resolving conflict, please visit www.understandinginconflict.org.
Thank you to today's guest for being with us today, and to our CUC Connect members whose support enables the Center for Understanding in Conflict to bring new perspectives in the field of conflict resolution and mediation to you, our listener, in each new episode. You can find out more about today's episode, along with full interviews and additional information about conflict resolution and mediation using the understanding-based model at www.understandinginconflict.org.